In the House of Suddhoo by Rudyard Kipling. Narrated by Robin Nixon. A stone's throw out on either hand from that well-ordered road we tread, and all the world is wild and strange. Churl and ghoul and djinn and sprite shall bear us company tonight, for we have reached the oldest land wherein the powers of darkness range. From the dusk to the dawn. The house of Suddhoo near the Tuxali Gate is two-storied with 4 carved windows of old brown wood and a flat roof. You may recognise it by 5 red handprints arranged like the 5 of diamonds on the whitewash between the upper windows. Bhagwan Das, the grocer, and a man who says he gets his living by seal cutting, live in the lower story with a troop of wives, servants, friends, and retainers. The 2 upper rooms used to be occupied by Janu and Azizun, and a little black and tan terrier that was stolen from an Englishman's house and given to Janu by a soldier. Today, only Janu lives in the upper rooms. Suddhoo sleeps on the roof, generally, except when he sleeps in the street. He used to go to Peshawar in the cold weather to visit his son who sells curiosities near the Edwards Gate, and then he slept under a real mud roof. Suddhoo is a great friend of mine because his cousin had a son who secured, thanks to my recommendation, the post of head messenger to a big firm in the station. Suddhoo says that God will make me a lieutenant governor one of these days. I dare say his prophecy will come true. He is very, very old, with white hair and no teeth worth showing, and he has outlived his wits, outlived nearly everything except his fondness for his son at Peshawar. Janu and Azizun are Kashmiris, ladies of the city, and theirs was an ancient and more or less honourable profession. But Azizun has since married a medical student from the northwest, and has settled down to a most respectable life somewhere near Bareilly. Bhagwan Das is an extortionate and an adulterer. He is very rich. The man who is supposed to get his living by seal cutting pretends to be very poor. This lets you know as much as is necessary of the 4 principal tenants in the House of Suddhoo. And then there is me, of course, but I am only the chorus that comes in at the end to explain things, so I do not count. Suddhoo was not clever. The man who pretended to cut seals was the cleverest of them all. Bhagwan Das only knew how to lie, except Janu. She was beautiful, but that was her own affair. Suddhoo's son at Peshawar was attacked by pleurisy, and old Suddhoo was troubled. The seal-cutter man heard of Suddhoo's anxiety and made capital out of it. He was abreast of the times. He got a friend in Peshawar to telegraph daily accounts of his son's health. And here the story begins. Suddhoo's cousin's son told me one evening that Suddhoo wanted to see me, that he was too old and feeble to come personally, and that I should be conferring an everlasting honour on the House of Suddhoo if I went to him. I went, but I think, seeing how well off Suddhoo was then, that he might have sent something better than an ekka, which jolted fearfully, to haul out a future lieutenant governor to the city on a muggy April evening. The ekka did not run quickly. It was full dark when we pulled up opposite the door of Ranjit Singh's tomb near the main gate of the fort. Here was Suddhoo, and he said that by reason of my condescension it was absolutely certain that I should become a lieutenant governor while my hair was yet black. Then we talked about the weather and the state of my health and the wheat crops for 15 minutes in the Hazuri Bagh under the stars. Suddhoo came to the point at last. He said that Janu had told him that there was an order of the Sarkar against magic, because it was feared that magic might one day kill the Empress of India. I didn't know anything about the state of law, but I fancied that something interesting was going to happen. I said that so far from magic being discouraged by the government, it was highly commended. The greatest officials of the state practiced it themselves. If the financial statement isn't magic, I don't know what is. Then, to encourage him further, I said that if there was any jadoo afoot, I had not the least objection to giving it my countenance and sanction, and to seeing that it was clean jadoo, white magic, as distinguished from the unclean jadoo, which kills folk. It took a long time before Suddhoo admitted that this was just what he had asked me to come for. and then he told me, in jerks and quavers, that the man who said he cut seals was a sorcerer of the cleanest kind, that every day he gave Suddhoo news of the sick son in Peshawar more quickly than the lightning could fly, and that this news was always corroborated by the letters. Further, he had told Suddhoo how a great danger was threatening his son, which could be removed by a clean jadoo, and, of course, heavy payment. I began to see exactly how the land lay, and told Suddhoo that I also understood a little jadoo in the Western line, and would go to his house to see that everything was done decently and in order. We set off together, and on the way Suddhoo told me that he had paid the seal cutter between 100 and 200 rupees already, and the jadoo of that night would cost 200 more, which was cheap, he said, considering the greatness of his son's danger, but I do not think he meant it. The lights were all cloaked in the front of the house when we arrived. I could hear awful noises from behind the seal cutter's shop front, as if someone were groaning his soul out. Suddhoo shook all over, and while we groped our way upstairs, told me that the jadoo had begun. Janu and Azizan met us at the stairhead and told us that the jadoo work was coming off in their rooms because there was more space there. Janu is a lady of a free-thinking turn of mind. She whispered that the jadoo was an invention to get money out of Suddhoo, and that the seal cutter would go to a hot place when he died. Suddhoo was nearly crying with fear and old age. He kept walking up and down the room in the half-light, repeating his son's name over and over again, and asking Azizan if the seal cutter ought not to make a reduction in the case of his own landlord. Janu pulled me over to the shadow in the recess of the carved bow windows. The boards were up, and the rooms were only lit by one tiny oil lamp. There was no chance of my being seen if I stayed still. Presently, the groans below ceased, and we heard steps on the staircase. That was the seal cutter. He stopped outside the door as the terrier barked, and Azizan fumbled at the chain, and he told Suddhoo to blow out the lamp. This left the place in jet darkness, except for the red glow from the two huckers that belonged to Janu and Azizan. The seal cutter came in, and I heard Suddhoo throw himself down on the floor and groan. Azizan caught her breath, and Janu backed onto one of the beds with a shudder. There was a clink of something metallic, and then shot up a pale blue-green flame near the ground. The light was just enough to show Azizan pressed against one corner of the room with the terrier between her knees. Janu, with her hands clasped, leaning forward as she sat on the bed. Suddhoo, face down, quivering, and the seal cutter. I hope I may never see another man like that seal cutter. He was stripped to the waist, with a wreath of white jasmine as thick as my wrist around his forehead, a salmon-coloured loincloth round his middle, and a steel bangle on each ankle. This was not awe-inspiring. It was the face of the man that turned me cold. It was blue-grey in the first place. In the second, the eyes were rolled back till you could only see the whites of them. And in the third, the face was the face of a demon. A ghoul, anything you please, except of the sleek, oily old ruffian who sat in the daytime over his turning lathe downstairs. He was lying on his stomach with his arms turned and crossed behind him, as if he'd been thrown down, pinioned. His head and neck were the only parts of him off the floor. They were nearly at right angles to his body, like the head of a cobra at spring. It was ghastly. In the centre of the room, on the bare earth floor, stood a big, deep brass basin with a pale blue-green light floating in the centre, like a nightlight. Around that basin, the man on the floor wriggled himself 3 times. How he did it, I do not know. I could see the muscles ripple along his spine and fall smooth again, but I could not see any other motion. The head seemed the only thing alive about him, except that slow curl and uncurl of the labouring back muscles. Janu from the bed was breathing 70 to the minute. Azizan held her hands before her eyes, and old Suddhoo, fingering at the dirt that had got into his white beard, was crying to himself. The horror of it was that the creeping, crawling thing made no sound, only crawled. And remember, this lasted for 10 minutes, while the terrier whined and Azizan shuddered, and Janu gasped and Suddhoo cried. I felt the hair lift at the back of my head, and my heart thump like a thermantidote paddle. Luckily, the seal cutter betrayed himself by his most impressive trick, and made me calm again. After he had finished that unspeakable triple crawl, he stretched his head away from the floor as high as he could, and sent out a jet of fire from his nostrils. Now, I knew how fire spouting is done. I can do it myself, so I felt at ease. The business was a fraud. If he'd only kept to that crawl without trying to raise the effect, goodness knows what I might have thought. Both the girls shrieked at the jet of fire, and the head dropped, chin down, on the floor, with a thud, the whole body lying then like a corpse, with its arms trussed. And there was a pause of 5 full minutes after this, and the blue-green flame died down. Janu stooped to settle one of her anklets, while Azizan turned her face to the wall and took the terrier in her arms. Suddhoo put out an arm mechanically to Janu's hukka, and she slid it across the floor with her foot. Directly above the body and on the wall were a couple of flaming portraits in stamped paper frames of the Queen and the Prince of Wales. They looked down on the performance, and to my thinking seemed to heighten the grotesqueness of it all. Just when the silence was getting unendurable, the body turned over and rolled away from the basin to the side of the room, where it lay stomach up. There was a faint plop from the basin, exactly like the noise a fish makes when it takes a fly, and the green light in the centre revived. I looked at the basin and saw, bobbing in the water, the dried, shrivelled black head of a native baby, open eyes, open mouth, and shaved scalp. It was worse, being so very sudden, than the crawling exhibition. We had no time to say anything before it began to speak. Read Poe's account of the voice that came from the mesmerising dying man, and you will realise less than one half of the horror of that head's voice. There was an interval of a second or two between each word, and a sort of ring, ring, ring in the note of the voice, like the timbre of a bell. It pealed slowly, as if talking to itself, for several minutes before I got rid of my cold sweat. Then the blessed solution struck me. I looked at the body lying near the doorway, and saw, just where the hollow of the throat joins on the shoulders, a muscle that had nothing to do with any man's regular breathing, twitching away steadily. The whole thing was a careful reproduction of the Egyptian terrafin that one reads about sometimes, and the voice was as clever and as appalling a piece of ventriloquism as one could wish to hear. All this time the head was lip-lapping against the side of the basin, and speaking. It told Suddhoo, on his face again whining, of his son's illness, and of the state of the illness up to the evening of that very night. I always shall respect the seal cutter for keeping so faithfully to the time of the Peshawar telegrams. It went on to say that skilled doctors were night and day watching over the man's life, and that he would eventually recover if the fee to the potent sorcerer whose servant was the head in the basin were doubled. Here the mistake from the artistic point of view came in. To ask for twice your stipulated fee in a voice that Lazarus might have used when he rose from the dead is absurd. Janu, who is really a woman of masculine intellect, saw this as quickly as I did. I heard her say, "Asli nahin, Farib," scornfully under her breath, and just as she said so, the light in the basin died out. The head stopped talking, and we heard the room door creak on its hinges. Then Janu struck a match, lit the lamp, and we saw that head, basin, and seal cutter were gone. Suddhoo was wringing his hands and explaining to anyone who cared to listen that if his chances of eternal salvation depended on it, he could not raise another 200 rupees. Azizan was nearly in hysterics in the corner, while Janu sat down composedly on one of the beds to discuss the probabilities of the whole thing being a banal, or make-up. I explained as much as I knew of the seal cutter's way of Jadoo, but her argument was much more simple. "The magic that is always demanding gifts is no true magic," said she. "My mother told me that the only potent love spells are those which are told you for love. This seal-cutter man is a liar and a devil. I dare not tell, do anything or get anything done, because I am in debt to Bhagwan Das, the Banir, for 2 gold rings and a heavy anklet. I must get my food from his shop. The seal-cutter is the friend of Bhagwan Das, and he would poison my food. A full Suddhoo has been going on for 10 days, and has cost Suddhoo many rupees each night. The seal cutter used black hens and lemons and mantras before. He never showed us anything like this till tonight. Azizan is a fool, and will be a Purdanashin soon. Suddhoo has lost his strength and his wits. See now, I had hoped to get from Suddhoo many rupees while he lived, and many more after his death, and behold, he is spending everything on that offspring of a devil and a she-ass, the seal cutter." Here I said, "But what induced Suddhoo to drag me into the business? Of course I can speak to the seal cutter, and he shall refund. The whole thing is child's talk, shame and senseless." "Suddhoo is an old child," said Janu. He has lived on the roofs these 70 years and is as senseless as a milk-goat. He brought you here to assure himself that he is not breaking any law of the Sirkar, whose salt he ate many years ago. He worships the dust off the feet of the seal-cutter, and the cow-devourer has forbidden him to go and see his son. What does Suddhoo know of your laws or the lightning post? I have to watch his money going day by day to that lying beast below." Janu stamped her foot on the floor and nearly cried with vexation, while Suddhoo was whimpering under a blanket in the corner, and Azizun was trying to guide the pipe stem to his foolish old mouth. Now, the case stands thus. Unthinkingly, I have laid myself open to the charge of aiding and abetting the seal-cutter in obtaining money under false pretences, which is forbidden by Section 420 of the Indian Penal Code. I am helpless in the matter for these reasons. I cannot inform the police. What witnesses would support my statements? Janu refuses flatly, and Azizun is a veiled woman somewhere near Bareilly, lost in this big India of ours. I dare not again take the law into my own hands and speak to the seal-cutter, for certain am I that not only would Suddhoo disbelieve me, but this step would end in the poisoning of Janu, who is bound hand and foot by her debt to the Banir. Suddhoo is an old dotard, and whenever we meet, mumbles my idiotic joke that the Sirkar rather patronises the black art than otherwise. His son is well now, but Suddhoo is completely under the influence of the seal-cutter, by whose advice he regulates the affairs of his life. Janu watches daily the money that she hoped to wheedle out of Suddhoo taken by the seal-cutter, and becomes daily more furious and sullen. She will never tell, because she dare not. But unless something happens to prevent her, I am afraid that the seal-cutter will die of cholera, the white arsenic kind, about the middle of May, and thus I shall be privy to a murder in the house of Suddhoo.